do I do?
Oh, apologies. Wait a minute. It's...
Hey. Okay.
Try.
Sorry, I was one of those that stopped up really late, so I'm going to read. Okay. Apart from Kinsey's perplexity over why medically transitioning people would forego their capacity for orgasm, he had little to say about trans people per se. Kinsey et al.'s legacy is that he documented the enormous gap between social values and morality of the day and sexual practices taking place within American society. Moreover, Kinsey's attempt to establish scientific rigour surrounding the science of sexuality, according to some, helped reform the way we look at the binary division between homosexuality and the righteous heterosexuality. By blurring the definitive lines between homosexual and heterosexual practices, Kinsey revolutionised the ways that desire, sexual orientation and sexual practices were understood. Kinsey et al. Challenged the contemporaneous construction of homosexuality by illustrating that a large number of men and women in the United States experience same-sex sexuality at some stage in their lives. And as such, the grounds for regarding homosexuality as either abnormal or pathological was not a scientific argument, but a moral and political one, based on violations of God's will, that intimately ties sexuality into the binary gender. So Kinsey et al.'s reports argued that in both males and females, homosexual and heterosexual do not represent two distinct types. They said the world is not to be divided into sheep and goats, not all things are black, not all things white. Only the human mind invents categories and tries to force facts into separate pigeonholes. In analyses of Kinsey et al.'s work, the sexuality continuum figures large, not because they believed that people were on a continuum, they didn't, but because of some subsequent theories surrounding their work. This later work suggests that on the one hand, there are nodal points where people can be placed within the bipolar extremes of homosexuality and heterosexuality. Some commentators suggest that the continuum allows us to understand that people can move from node to node upon the continuum temporally and perhaps spatially, illustrating a certain degree of sexual plasticity, and as a matter, and I quote, of individual differences within continuous scheme of sexual distribution. On the other hand, it unwittingly reaffirms the sense that the two extremes of homosexuality and heterosexuality are not only separate typologies of sexuality, desires and sexual practices, but also dismisses the intersections of cultural and social variations, including those within class, ethnic, gender, and aesthetic structures. The continuum is often illustrated as a horizontal rather than a vertical or graded continuum, i.e. that way rather than that way, instilling a lessening of the actual relationship to and within a hierarchical world. So does Kinsey's work on sexualities in a post-closet context correspond in any way to the emergence of trans asterisk, as a scheme for understanding trans asterisk identities and practices? Was Kinsey's critique of binary sexuality and redefinition of sexual difference, perhaps in similar ways, paved the way for early imagining around the gender schemes as gender continuums, first illustrated much earlier in the sexological work of Edward Carpenter's Uranians, or Third Sexes, Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inverts, Hirschfeld's Sexual Intermediaries. The emergence of trans asterisks as new forms of gender identity and gender expression that combine elements of the masculine and feminine consist of the already established performative discourse of binary genders that are related to the consciousness of a prior sexed body. If we understand trans as across or beyond or on the opposite side of, these are quite different in meaning and can be witnessed in the plethora of identities that are often subsumed under the term trans. For instance, beyond gender, as in non-gendered or genderless identities, seem to want to suggest that they are free from gender performativity and, in the words of Virginia Woolf, want to ignore the persistent voice of a patriarchal sex system. This also suggests that non-gendered and genderless identities are beyond a dialectic understanding of gender identity and hover over the continuum in liminal spaces without a fixed nodal home. Whilst this seems to me potentially a universal phenomenon insofar as most of us would hover beyond the performative discourse of gender roles and masculinity and femininity because of the many transgressions that our expressions, behaviours and aesthetic depict, we are in fact determined or forced to relate to and then differentiate from a particular binary gender category. In other words, to hover beyond gender, we assume that there is gender in the first place. At the other extreme, those trans people, and I don't mean extreme in a negative sense, but on the other side, a different form of trans, let's say, those trans people who go across gender, either permanently or occasionally, invest in gender in different ways. These people require intelligible nodal homes upon the continuum in order for their identities to be recognised. For instance, transitioning people either through the use of technology or artefacts, whether one regards oneself as a woman or man with a trans history, or those who transition indefinitely and cross-dress, suppose that there is gender with which one was and now is not. This is either when going across is permanent or intermittent crossing. An example of this is in relation to those who transition permanently and illustrated in a subsection of the trans social movement. These advocates depict their identities within a genetic imprimatur model. Some are utilising a disorder of sex development or a difference in sex development. The two terms are used interchangeably in this trans movement, which I'm going to say DSD, whatever, just for shortness, narrative, in an attempt to subvert psychological categories for biogenetic categories, in a bid to challenge the psychiatric understanding of gender dysphoria. Trans advocates' claims are often in the form of a cerebral DSD condition. Drawing on contested biological research, advocates often suggest that their gender identities are a product of dispositions caused by hormonal influences in fetus, which has affected their desire to transition. As one website illustrates, many transgender people have believed for the longest time that biology had been the cause. I myself believe this, as my earliest memories were that of wanting to be a girl even before I learned to spell. Hopefully further studies like this will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the phenomenon is a natural occurrence, leading to social acceptance of transgender people. The study which this website is drawing on is a genetic-based study, which has since been unreplicated, or not replicated again in science, and also another study found a completely different finding to the original study, So these websites are using kind of contested science in order to push this biogenetic discourse forward, There is little understanding of the political implications of these subversions. The biogenetic position, however, may prove to be problematic in a number of other ways. For instance, the claims to a biogenetic disposition, i.e. DSD embodiment, or bisexuality, and a particular gender identity simultaneously are untenable because they're underpinned by two different logics. The notion that people with a DSD are inherently one gender or another and compelled to transition because of an underlying biogenetic position is too simplistic. Existing research into multiple forms of DSD, I don't want to keep going like that, but you know, I'm not advocating that term, yeah? But in existing research, they are using that term now. So, existing research into multiple forms of DSD illustrate that there is more variability to gender identity outcomes than was previously assumed, and that's some research by Cohen-Kutternes. For example, researchers suggested that many prenatally testosterone-exposed individuals raised as girls continue to have an adult female gender identity, even though they've got a DSD position, yeah? Which is important, and I'll go on to tell you why in a minute. So, and masculine gender role behaviours in DSD female-raised children should not be mistaken for a male gender identity. Now, Cohen-Kutternes, if that's how you pronounce it, argues that it's important to distinguish between gender identity and gender role when considering DSD. Gender identity is characterised in much of the DSD literature as a sense of oneself as male, female, or indeterminate, whereas gender role is characterised as behaviours, personality traits, and interests that society applies to these aspects, and the way that people are measured against these stereotypical attributes. Now, gender dysphoria aligned to DSD position would have to presuppose that DSD people would, like many of the trans advocates utilising this discord, need right bodies that matches their inherent masculine or feminine gender identities. As such, a separate typology of masculine and feminine gendered practices and desires are required to reaffirm this position. Whilst there is some evidence to suggest that DSD people do identify with a particular gender identity and do wish for normative bodies, the evidence also suggests that we cannot discount psychosocial development as irrelevant for them. The DSD position corresponding to a particular gender identity is not always evidenced in the literature. As we know from the discourses surrounding transitioning practices, roles and identities can be considerably modified by psychological, social, and cultural factors. So, for instance, many trans people state, for instance, that they tried to live as a man or a woman, but living that life for many years became untenable. Yeah, so the roles were, but it becomes untenable, so you change roles, you change aesthetic, and so on and so forth. But what's more important, however, is that there is contrary evidence about connecting DSD and a particular binary gender identity. Some DSD people want to and do live beyond a binary system of gender roles, gender identities, and embodiment. Mary MacDonald from the UK Intersex Association states, given the choice of male, female, or intersex, I would unhesitatingly select intersex, but society does not give me that option. Essentialist claims are made in order to subvert any medico-legal opposition to transitioning technologies for DSD trans people. The causal story of gender dysphoria seems to appeal to some trans advocates because biogenetic scientists are socially legitimated experts. Given the relative power that biogenetic narrative maintains in society, and particularly in medicine, it seems like a wise appropriation of essentialism. However, the trans web-based materials depicting DSD embodiment and the desire to transition to a particular gender tend to mirror the simplistic dualisms that invent categories and try to force facts into separate nodal homes in the biological research. Most notably that gender, masculinity and femininity, and natures. We could argue that this is a prime example of epistemic violence of differences in sexual development towards differences in sexual development identities through the binary logic that affords some things intelligible while everything else is regarded as marginal or meaningless, such as an indeterminate body and an indeterminate identity. Yeah. It is thus vital that we be vigilant in critically examining the structures of modern epistemologies and claims of binary genders and interrogate their workings as Kinsey attempted to do. As an academic and writer, I think, and learning from feminist research, then we have to kind of put ourselves in the other space before we write, you know, and claim these positions too, you know. So the essentialist trans websites take for granted that scientists, like the one on the video, who have the power to judge gendered behaviour, have assigned unbiased meanings to the biological features used in their continuum studies. These assignments, critics have suggested, far exceed, in any sociological sense, anything warranted by biology. So, the biological variables are actually sociological variables. They're not scientific, you know. So moreover, these biological assignments often conceal the relationship between the trans person and a gendered world. Accordingly, in the sexological literature and essentialist arm of trans advocacy, there is widespread concealing of the multiple ways that trans people live their social lives, and as such, maintain problematic and contestable dualisms. As a result, the diverse phenomenology of trans people becomes both asocial and epistemologically intransient, a legacy that Kinsey et al. Would not take as their own. And that's all I want to say.
Oh.